Welcome to this set review of March of the Machine Aftermath. Aftermath is a relatively small set with only 50 cards, so this should be a shorter than normal analysis. I've grouped the cards into two categories: cards I think are likely to see play, and cards I think are unlikely to see play, but nonetheless there's something worth discussing about them. Let's start with the good cards. Nissa, Resurgent Animist, is a green 3-mana 3/3 legendary elf with a landfall ability that adds a mana. Additionally, when you trigger it for exactly the second time, it also reveals cards from the top until you hit an elf or elemental and puts it into your hand. So essentially, it's a 3-mana Lotus Cobra that, in combination with fetch lands, draws you a random elf or elemental. So first, let's start with the bad. Lotus Cobra has thus far proven to not be good enough in older formats, and Nissa is 1 mana more expensive. She does nothing when she enters and requires you to ship the turn before generating any value. But on the other hand, her stats are decent and her tribal draw ability is quite good, being tied to 2 of the most prolific and competitively viable tribes in elves or elementals. She feels like a mini Omnath, or maybe a mix between Omnath and Risen Reef. Elf decks tend to either be aggro or combo based, whereas Nissa feels more like a value card, so if she shows up anywhere, I'd bet on elementals being more likely. Speaking of tribal decks, Coppercoat Vanguard is the newest staple for humans. It's a white 2-mana 2/2 human that gives each of your other humans +1/+0 and ward 1. It provides tribal human decks with a second 2-mana lord after Thalia's Lieutenant. Human decks did already have the option to play Mayor of Averbrook, but Coppercoat is a significant upgrade. It's in white, which means the mono white decks can play it, and ward 1 is a far more relevant ability than what Mayor did. Coppercoat should be a shoo-in for every human-based aggro deck in Pioneer, and in Modern Humans if that deck ever manages to claw its way back onto the scene. Continuing with tribes, we have Markov Baron, a black 3-mana 2/2 vampire with Convoke and Madness, lifelink, and it gives other vampires +1/+1. Notably, Convoke and Madness work in tandem so that if you discard it, you can use Convoke to pay for Madness. Vampire decks in Pioneer have been hovering around playability, mostly enabled by Sorin Imperious Bloodlord, and Markov Baron should be a fine addition to them. Sticking with the tribal theme, and boy there are a lot of tribal cards, we've got Sigarda, Font of Blessings, a green and white 4-mana 4/4 legendary angel with flying. Your other permanents have hexproof, and you can look at and cast angels or humans from the top of your library. We recently had Errant and Giada as a great addition to Angels and Spirits decks, with it also being a flyer that lets you cast spells from the top. Sigarda appears to follow in the same footsteps, being yet another cross-tribal card, although not as efficient at 4 mana, which also unfortunately puts it outside the range of Collected Company. It's also reminiscent of Shalai, which was used in the past as a protection effect in decks like Devoted Druid. Sigarda is more flexible since it grants hexproof to everything, not just creatures. Finally, moving away from tribes, we have Nixilis Captive Kingpin, a black and red 4-mana 4/3 legend with flying, trample, and whenever an opponent loses exactly 1 life, put a +1 counter on Nixilis and exile your top card, which you may play until your next end step. Nixilis is potentially a powerful top-end card advantage engine in any deck that can repeatedly cause life loss in increments of exactly 1 at a time. Decks that immediately come to mind are Rakdos-based sacrifice decks, primarily in Pioneer, that use cards like Cauldron Familiar, Mayhem Devil, Oni Cult Anvil, and Goblin Bombardment. Nixilis is also notable for being yet another card that goes infinite with All Will Be One. Moving down to more speculative cards, let's start with Nahiri's Resolve. This is a red and white 5-mana enchantment that gives your creatures +1/+0 and haste, and at the beginning of your end step, you can flicker any number of non-token artifacts and creatures you control and return them on upkeep. There are a number of decks that utilize large amounts of cards with ETB triggers, with some notable examples being Elementals and Bant Company in Modern. Anyone who's played with Yorion knows how powerful this kind of mass blinking effect can be, and Nahiri's Resolve is potentially a very potent top-end card advantage engine. The +1 and haste are also relevant bonuses that shouldn't be overlooked. With all that said, Nahiri's Resolve does require a lot of setup, and unlike Yorion, it's confined to only artifacts and creatures. Moving on, Filter Out is a blue 3-mana instant that bounces all the non-creature, non-land permanents to their owner's hands. The best point of comparison for this would be a card like Hurkyl's Recall, although there are obviously differences. So, what are the use cases? As we've seen with Recall, you can use it as a big tempo swing sideboard card against decks that run many non-creature permanents like Blue-White Control, Enchantress, or Enigmatic Fires. Or you can use it in conjunction with your own cheap spells, such as 0-mana artifacts, to bounce and replay them for value, or save them from sweepers like Meltdown. Finally, in the category of good cards, we have Cosmic Rebirth, a green and white 3-mana instant that gains 3 life and either returns a permanent with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, or a permanent of any mana value to your hand. We've seen cheap reanimation effects that are capped at lower mana values be played before, for example, Can't Stay Away in Greasefang and Recommission in Heliod decks. The biggest strike against Rebirth is that it's 1 mana more expensive, and the 3 mana cards with this effect like Patch Up haven't seen play. However, Rebirth is also more flexible in what it does and is an instant, and gaining 3 life is also relevant for Heliod. Now, let's move on to the quote-unquote bad cards. I do think most of the cards in the set won't see competitive play, and the following ones are no exception, but these ones are more interesting and more worthy of discussion. Jirina, Dauntless General, is a white and black 2-mana 2/2 legendary human with, when it enters the battlefield, exile target player's graveyard and sacrifice her to give humans hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. I don't think this combination of abilities and stats are good enough, but Jirina is noteworthy for being the cheapest version of the eliminate a graveyard effect we've ever had on a creature aside from Endurance. Moving on, Reckless Handling is a red 2-mana sorcery that searches for an artifact, puts it into your hand, and then you discard a random card. If you discard an artifact, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. The 2 damage isn't very relevant, which means Reckless Handling is basically a 2-mana gamble that only searches for artifacts. Gamble is traditionally used to find cards you don't mind discarding anyway, such as Life from the Loam, since you don't want to risk discarding the card you searched for if you really need it in your hand. Since Reckless Handling only finds artifacts, it feels like a worse Goblin Engineer, which would relegate it to Pioneer only, at which point I don't think it's good enough. Spark Rupture is a white 3-mana enchantment that draws a card on ETB and removes the abilities of Planeswalkers, instead turning them into vanilla creatures with stats equal to their loyalty counters. The first way to look at Spark Rupture is as a stacks piece for Planeswalkers. Previously, the only things that hit them were either very narrow cards like Pithing Needle that would only answer one specific type of Planeswalker, or you'd be forced to go all the way up to 6 mana for the Immortal Sun. Spark Rupture hates on walkers for 3 mana and draws a card. Unfortunately, I think it's bad for a number of reasons. First, even though Planeswalkers show up in many decks, very few are highly reliant on them. The only decks that come to mind are Blue-White Control and Nykthos Ramp. Secondly, among those, Blue-White Control typically plays many ways of getting rid of enchantments, including cards like Prismatic Ending, Leyline Binding, March of Otherworldly Light, and Farewell. And third, turning your opponent's Planeswalkers into likely 4 power or higher creatures that can beat you down is not a great trade-off. The other way to use Spark Rupture would be to turn your own high loyalty Planeswalkers into beaters, but this doesn't seem good either since most Planeswalkers don't have high enough loyalty for jumping through these hoops to be worth it, and nearly all Planeswalkers are 3+ mana, meaning this synergy doesn't curve well. Lastly, there's Vesuvan Drifter, a blue 3-mana 2/4 flyer that, at the beginning of combat, both yours and your opponent's, you may reveal the top card of your library, and if it's a creature, Drifter becomes a copy of it with flying until end of turn. The most ideal strategy for this card would seem to be to tutor a powerful creature to the top, one which has either a devastating attack trigger or which deals lethal damage in one hit. There are numerous cards that tutor for a creature and put it on top, but most have restrictions of some kind. Congregation at Dawn can put any creature on top, at which point your best options are probably Emrakul or Blightsteel Colossus. Alternatively, Flamekin Harbinger is cheap and can fetch Yargle and Multani to the top to deal 18 in the air. Any way you conceive it, this is a lot of hoops to jump through, requires 3+ colors, and seems incredibly clunky overall. I hope you've enjoyed this look at March of the Machine Aftermath. Thank you to my supporters, and if you enjoy these videos, consider supporting the channel, and take care.